family company to Sis. So I cashed the competitor's check on live stream. The words, my words, glared back at me from the broadcast title field, stark and brutal under the unforgiving white light of the ring lamp. My finger, slick with a sudden, cold sweat, twitched over the Go Live button. A digital guillotine, poised, one click, and the blade would fall, severing not just ties, but the very marrow of the Tran family. The viewer count was already a sickening, thrilling surge in the corner of my screen, 12,000 anonymous faces, hungry for a spectacle. They were about to get one worthy of the goddamn Colosseum. A tremor started in my hand, a traitorous quiver I fought to still. This wasn't stage fright. This was the seismic shock of a man about to detonate his own life and his family's for the world to see. On the borrowed, gleaming expanse of the mahogany desk, a stage fitting for this corporate regicide, lay the props for my rebellion. A pen, heavy in silver, embossed with the familiar, arrogant swirl of the Tran Consolidated logo, the company my blood was supposed to nourish, now a symbol of my emasculation. And beside it, its nemesis, a check from Sterling Pike Industries. The paper felt alive in my other hand, electric, its 7 figures a screaming indictment of my family's blindness. Sterling Pike, the wolves always at Tran Consolidated's door, the rival my father had spent his life battling, the name that was pure anathema in our household. Now, they were my salvation. Or my damnation. Probably both. My heart wasn't just hammering. It was trying to batter its way out of my chest, each beat a fresh infusion of ice-cold fury. 31 years. 31 years of being Alex Tran. The other son. The quiet one. The detail guy overshadowed by the radiant supernova that was my sister. Michelle. She. The anointed one. The golden child destined for the throne, and for me, I was the court jester. They occasionally let count the gold. You're a numbers guy. Alex, stick to what you know, Dad would say. A gentle pat on the head that always felt like a shove downwards. Michelle, 3 years my senior, effortlessly brilliant, effortlessly condescending, the heir apparent from the moment she could articulate a 5-year plan at age 10, and now, the ultimate coronation. The news hadn't been broken gently. It had been delivered with the casual cruelty of a routine business announcement over lukewarm pot roast last Tuesday. We've decided, Alex, Mom began, her gaze skittering away from mine, that Michelle is best positioned to take Tran Consolidated forward as sole CEO. Soul. The word had echoed in the cavern of my chest. Dad had mumbled something about synergy and streamlined leadership, his eyes fixed on his plate as if it held the secrets of the universe. But it was Michelle's smile that had twisted the knife. That soft, pitying curve of her lips as she'd said, "Don't worry, little brother. There will always be a place for you. Maybe you can manage my personal investments, keep you busy." The sheer, unadulterated arrogance of it. Keep me busy. Like a goddamn hobbyist. That night, the inferno had been lit. The polite nods, the carefully constructed facade of the understanding son I'd worn for decades, it had all burned to ash. Sterling Pike's overtures, which I'd politely rebuffed for months out of some lingering, misplaced loyalty, suddenly seemed like a lifeline thrown into a raging sea. Their offer wasn't just a job, it was a kingdom of my own, built on the respect my own family denied me. The check wasn't just a signing bonus, it was the ammunition I needed. 22,000 viewers. The number was a drug. Fueling the reckless audacity coursing through me, I could almost feel their collective breath. Waiting. My own breath hitched. This was performance art, painted with the acid of betrayal. I forced my lips into a smile, a predatory baring of teeth that felt more honest than any smile I'd given my family in years. "Good evening, everyone," I purred into the microphone, my voice a low, dangerous thrum. Tonight, we're not dissecting market trends. We're dissecting a dynasty. We're talking about value, inherent, intrinsic value, and what happens when those who should cherish it most spit on it instead. My gaze, cold and hard, fixed on the Sterling Pike check. I lifted it, ensuring the camera captured every damning zero, every perfectly printed letter of their name, Tran Consolidated, my family's company. I began. Each word a perfectly placed explosive charge has recently undergone a leadership transition. A decision was made. My sister, Michelle Tran, will be taking the helm exclusively. The live chat exploded. Question marks, exclamations, little fire emojis. Perfect. They believe she is their future. I continued, a dangerous edge to my voice. And who am I to argue with their wisdom? A beat of silence, thick with unspoken rage, but I, as a financial strategist, have always advocated for diversification, for not being shackled to a single, depreciating asset. My eyes burned into the camera lens, imagining I could see them, my parents aghast, Michelle, her perfect composure finally cracking. So, when Sterling Pike Industries, a company known for its aggressive growth and keen eye for talent, made me an offer that didn't just see my potential but was willing to bankroll it, handsomely, I let the implication hang, heavy and suffocating. I picked up the silver Tran Consolidated pen. For a moment, I just looked at it. A lifetime of expectation, of disappointment, embodied in that sleek cylinder. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, I laid it down forever. I picked up the cheap, plastic ballpoint branded with the Sterling Pike logo. It felt like a scepter. I chose to accept their very generous terms. My hand, now surprisingly steady, positioned the Sterling Pike pen over the endorsement line on the back of that life-altering check. This, I announced, my voice dropping to a near whisper that carried more menace than any shout, is not just a financial transaction. This is a reckoning. The remote camera, cued by my silent signal to my unseen tech, zoomed in tight on the check, on my hand. This is Alex Tran, the undervalued asset, cashing out, on my terms, with the enemy, live. The scratch of the pen on the paper was a gunshot in the sudden, absolute silence of the thousands watching. Alex Tran. The ink flowed, black and irrevocable, sealing my rebellion, etching it into the digital ether for eternity. The chat feed froze, then erupted into a chaotic waterfall of text. My phone, forgotten on the desk, began to vibrate with the furious, desperate energy of a trapped animal, the screen blazing with a succession of forbidden names. Dad! Mom! Michelle! Urgent! Too late. The first shockwave of the explosion I'd just triggered was already ripping through their gilded world. And this, I thought with a grim, terrible satisfaction, was only the beginning. The digital pandemonium was a roaring beast in my ears, even with the chat window minimized. My phone continued its frantic dance across the mahogany, a buzzing, flashing tantrum I pointedly ignored. It was done. The first, most public, salvo had been fired. Now, the silence in the borrowed office felt deafening, amplifying the frantic thumping of my own pulse. For a moment, I just sat there, the Sterling Pike pen still clutched in my hand, the ghost of my signature still burning on the back of that check. Freedom. Or just a different kind of cage. My mind, a traitorous archive, immediately began replaying the highlight reel of slights, the slow burn of years that had led to this flashpoint. It wasn't just about the CEO title. It was about a lifetime of being the perennial runner-up in the Tran family stakes. Michelle, my older sister by 3 years, was born with a silver spoon not just in her mouth, but seemingly welded to her hand, a scepter she wielded with effortless grace and an almost terrifying self-assurance. She'd walked earlier, talked earlier, excelled in everything she touched. While I was struggling with algebra, she was winning national debate championships. While I was cautiously investing my allowance in penny stocks and actually making a decent return, not that anyone noticed, she was charming venture capitalists at charity galas Dad dragged her to. Our parents, immigrants who had clawed their way to success with Tran Consolidated, saw in Michelle the embodiment of their American dream, polished, articulate, and unburdened by the tentative anxieties that still clung to them. I, on the other hand, was quieter, more observant. I saw the numbers behind the bravado, the cracks in the polished facade. My insights, when offered, were often met with a polite, "That's interesting, Alex." Before the conversation inevitably swerved back to Michelle's latest triumph, the company, Tran Consolidated, started as a small import-export business by our grandparents, specializing in Southeast Asian textiles. Dad, with his relentless drive, had diversified it into light manufacturing and then, cannily, into niche tech components. It was his baby, his empire, and from the time we were children, it was implicitly understood that one of us would inherit it. Michelle, with her MBA from Stanford and her knack for schmoozing, was the obvious choice in their eyes. I, with my finance degree from a less prestigious but still excellent state university and my preference for data analysis over cocktail parties, was the spare, the reliable one, the one who could help out. Early tensions were subtle, the kind of sibling rivalry that parents often dismiss as normal. Except in our family. The scales were never balanced. Michelle got the lead roles in school plays. I was stage crew. Michelle got the new car at 16. I inherited her beat-up sedan 2 years later. Michelle's business proposals, even the half-baked ones, were lauded as visionary. My meticulously researched market analyses were good for background. The constant unspoken message was clear: she was the star. I was the supporting act, and God forbid the supporting act ever tried to upstage the lead. I remember one particularly galling incident when I was 24, fresh out of college and eager to prove myself at Tran Consolidated. I'd identified a significant inefficiency in our supply chain, drafted a detailed proposal that would save the company millions annually. I presented it to Dad, beaming with pride. He listened, nodded, and said, "Good work, Alex, very thorough. Why don't you run it by Michelle? Get her take." Michelle, who at the time was more focused on launching a boutique fashion line which tanked spectacularly a year later, a detail conveniently forgotten by all, glanced at my report, made a few superficial suggestions that actually weakened the core strategy, and then presented it to the board as a collaborative effort with her. Naturally, taking the lead. I'd seethed in silence. The injustice, a bitter pill. That was the pattern. My insights, my work, often repackaged, represented, and ultimately credited, at least in part, to Michelle's guiding hand. The killer instinct comment Dad had thrown at me during that fateful dinner, that had cut deep because it was a deliberate echo of what he'd always said I lacked compared to Michelle. She could be ruthless in negotiations, charming one moment and cutting the next. I preferred logic, data, a win-win where possible. My approach was deemed too soft, not aggressive enough for the top job. They mistook careful consideration for timidity, strategic patience for a lack of drive. As the years went by, my role solidified. I was the numbers guy, the financial wizard behind the curtain, making sure the company's engines ran smoothly while Michelle was out front, the glamorous face of Tran Consolidated. I crunched the data that informed her bold expansion strategies. I developed the risk mitigation models that protected her more daring ventures. I was indispensable, yet invisible, and the resentment, a slow-growing cancer, had metastasized. The irony was, I loved the business. Not the schmoozing, not the power plays, but the intricate dance of numbers, the thrill of spotting an opportunity, the satisfaction of building something tangible. I had ideas, big ideas, for how Tran Consolidated could adapt and thrive in a rapidly changing global market. Ideas that went beyond Michelle's often derivative strategies. But my voice was consistently muted, my ambition subtly, or not so subtly, curbed. Don't rock the boat. Alex, Mom would say, Michelle needs our full support. The decision to join Sterling Pike hadn't been made in a vacuum. They'd been headhunting me for over a year. Their CEO, a shrewd, self-made woman named Evelyn Hayes, saw something in me my own family refused to acknowledge. She didn't see a numbers guy. She saw a strategist, a future leader. Their offer was not just generous, it was respectful. It was a seat at the main table, not a stool in the corner. The live stream was still technically active, though I'd muted my mic and camera. The viewer count was holding steady, a testament to the sheer audacity of what had just transpired. My phone finally stopped vibrating, only to immediately light up with a text message from Michelle. Just 3 words. You'll regret this. A humorless laugh escaped me. Regret. Oh, I was past regret. Regret was a luxury for people who still had something to lose within the old framework. I just torched that framework. What I felt now was a terrifying, exhilarating surge of something else, something new. The opening salvo had landed. The shockwaves were just beginning. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was actually in control of the narrative, not just a footnote in Michelle's story. The stakes were no longer just about a company. They were about my very identity, my worth. And this war, I knew, was far from over. It had just officially begun. The days following the live stream were a blur of digital fallout and chilling silence from my family. The internet, predictably, had a field day. Tranaire's treachery, screamed one headline. Nepotism backfires in billion-dollar feud, blared another. My social media, once a quiet corner for financial commentary, was now a raging inferno of opinions, accusations, and, surprisingly, a fair amount of support from strangers who identified with the narrative of the overlooked underdog. Sterling Pike's PR team, a well-oiled machine, expertly fanned the flames, framing me as a visionary talent finally unshackled. Their stock saw a modest but noticeable uptick. Tran Consolidated's did not. The silence from my parents was the most unnerving. Not a single call, not a text. After that initial flurry during the broadcast, it was a heavy, suffocating blanket of disapproval, far more potent than any angry outburst. Michelle, however, was a different story. Her initial 3-word text was followed by a barrage of increasingly vitriolic messages, then a series of curt emails from her newly acquired corporate lawyer, hinting at potential legal action for breach of fiduciary duty, laughable, as I held no official executive role that would entail such a duty towards her company, and brand disparagement. It was textbook Michelle aggressive, immediate, and aimed for maximum intimidation. I, however, was already several steps ahead. Evelyn Hayes, CEO of Sterling Pike, had anticipated this. My own legal counsel, sharper and more discreet than anyone Tran Consolidated could muster on short notice, was ready. The counter-narrative was already seeded Alex Tran, a financial prodigy stifled by family politics, now free to innovate. The real escalation, though, came not through lawyers or media spin, but through a move so brazen, so Michelle. It almost made me laugh. Almost. About a week after the stream, as it was now being called, I received a registered letter. It wasn't from a law firm. It was from Tran Consolidated's HR department, a termination letter, for my consulting services. Services I hadn't officially rendered in over 6 months, not since they'd subtly phased me out of any meaningful strategic discussions, relegating me to ad hoc data requests. The letter was backdated, conveniently, to the day before my live stream. Attached was a severance check, a paltry sum, an insultingly small figure clearly calculated to add another layer of humiliation. Consulting services, I scoffed, crumpling the letter. This was Michelle's handiwork, no doubt. An attempt to discredit me further, to paint me as a disgruntled ex-employee lashing out, rather than a spurned son and capable executive making a strategic power play. It was petty. It was also a clear signal the gloves were off. They weren't just going to try and shame me, they were going to try and erase me. But the true gut punch, the new betrayal that deepened my emotional discomfort into something raw and aching, came a few days later. It arrived in the form of a forwarded email from a former colleague at Tran Consolidated, someone I'd always considered a friend, or at least a friendly acquaintance. The email, an internal memo circulated by Michelle herself, announced a new employee loyalty initiative. It detailed enhanced benefits, bonuses, and stock options for long-serving, dedicated team members who embody the Tran family values of commitment and integrity. Innocent enough on the surface. But then came the kicker. Buried in the third paragraph, as part of this initiative, we will also be reviewing all current and past freelance and consultant contracts to ensure alignment with our core principles. Those found to have acted in a manner detrimental to Tran Consolidated's interests or reputation will regrettably be deemed ineligible for future collaborations or considerations. It was a threat, clear and unambiguous, aimed not just at me, but at anyone within Tran Consolidated who might still harbor sympathies for me. Or worse, might be tempted to follow my lead. She was systematically isolating me, poisoning the well, ensuring that any bridge I might have had back to my old professional network within the company was burned to cinders. And then, the part that truly twisted the knife, she announced the immediate promotion of David Lee to head of financial strategy, the very role I had unofficially filled for years, the role I had coveted, the role I had been uniquely qualified for. David was competent, yes, but he was a yes man, someone who would never challenge Michelle's directives. He was safe, he was pliable, he was everything I wasn't. The memo went on to praise David's unwavering loyalty and team-first approach. A thinly veiled swipe at my perceived betrayal. Reading it, a cold dread washed over me. This wasn't just about business anymore. This was personal. Michelle wasn't just trying to win, she was trying to destroy my reputation, to salt the earth where my career had once stood. The casual cruelty of it, the calculated way she was turning my former colleagues against me, or at least making them too afraid to associate with me, felt like a fresh betrayal, more insidious than the initial act of disinheritance. She was dismantling my professional past, piece by piece. Evelyn Hayes. When I showed her the memo, just raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Amateur," she'd said, a dismissive wave of her hand. "She's scared. Alex, this is what frightened people do. They lash out, try to control the narrative with brute force. We'll be smarter." Smarter, yes, but the emotional toll was undeniable. The sting of seeing my contributions not just ignored, but actively erased and attributed to someone else, someone chosen for their malleability rather than their merit, was a fresh wound. It reinforced the narrative that had haunted me my whole life. I wasn't good enough. Or rather, my kind of good wasn't the right kind of good for the Tran family. This wasn't a clean break. It was a messy, painful amputation, and Michelle was determined to infect the stump. The stakes had just been raised from a corporate battle to a fight for my professional soul. And the discomfort, the anger, the sense of injustice, it all coiled tighter in my gut. A serpent preparing to strike. The accolades from Sterling Pike, Evelyn Hayes's sharp, approving nods, the financial press lauding me as a disruptive force, it all tasted like ashes. Each minor triumph was a grotesque counterpoint to the widening abyss where my family used to be. Michelle's strategy of silent, creeping excommunication was a masterpiece of passive aggression. It wasn't just the professional ghosting, the LinkedIn desertions. It was the sudden chill in once friendly neighborhood spots, the conversations that died abruptly if I walked too close. I was being systematically erased, rendered a non-entity by familial decree. The solitude was a physical pressure, a cold, crushing weight in my chest that stole my breath. My work became a frantic, almost manic obsession, the punishing hours a desperate, failing sprint to outrun the echoing emptiness of my apartment. Then, the email. Not a legal threat, not a corporate directive, not another media dissection. The sender, Mom? The word ignited on my screen, a small incendiary device, for a sickening, eternal moment. I froze. My heart didn't just stumble. It slammed against my ribs. A trapped bird fighting for escape. This was it, was the formal denunciation, the final crushing blow of parental excommunication I'd been steeling myself for. My hand, slick with an icy sweat, trembled above the trackpad, a condemned man unable to look away from the gallows. When the click finally came, a sound like a snapping bone in the silence. The message was not the expected barrage of fury. No recriminations, no overt anger, just a sterile, almost brutally polite invitation. Your grandmother's 80th birthday, family only, at the house. The casual, indifferent cruelty of its normalcy was a fresh, twisting stab. And then the postscript, in my mother's familiar, elegant cursive, a single line that felt like a garrote tightening around my throat. Your grandmother asks for you specifically. Alex, she has been quite unwell. Please, for her, unwell. The word detonated in the silent, sterile air of my apartment, reverberating off the cold glass and steel. My grandmother. The quiet, unwavering compass of my childhood, the only one whose love had never felt conditional, never measured against Michelle's brilliance. Her small, sun-filled kitchen, smelling of baked bread and old books, had been my truest refuge. She'd never interrogated me about profit margins or market share. She'd only ever asked if I was warm, if I was kind, if I remembered the stories she told. And now she was unwell, asking for me. The internal conflict wasn't a debate. It was a visceral, tearing agony. To go was to willingly step back into the fire, to offer myself up for their silent judgment, their pitying glances, Michelle's sharp, satisfied smile. It was to kneel. It was a grotesque betrayal of the iron-willed, defiant icon I'd so carefully, so publicly, forged in the crucible of that live stream. The Alex Tran who had metaphorically burned down the family business wouldn't grovel, wouldn't break before such blatant emotional coercion. He would calculate, execute, annihilate. But this transcended calculation. This was my grandmother, the image of her, diminished, her bright spirit clouded by illness, waiting for me, while I waged my public wars, drenched in the bile of ambition and revenge. The thought was a physical nausea, a self-loathing so profound it threatened to buckle my knees. Could I live with myself as the grandson who ignored that summons, who let pride, however justified, sever that final, sacred tie? The hours that followed were a descent into a maelstrom. I paced the confines of my luxury cage, the email glowing malevolently on the screen, each word a hook tearing at my resolve. Every rational argument for self-preservation, for maintaining my hardened stance, shattered against the frail, undeniable power of her need. The fury, the righteous indignation that had been my lifeblood, my armor, began to corrode, to flake away, exposing the raw, bleeding tissue of grief and a desperate, childlike yearning. This wasn't a strategic dilemma, it was an emotional vivisection, that killer instinct they prized, the one I supposedly lacked. I discovered its true absence now. I couldn't kill this. I couldn't kill the part of me that loved her. By the first gray light of dawn, I was a ruin. The reflection in the expansive window was a stranger, gaunt, haunted, stripped of all pretense. The decision, when it finally cohered from the chaos, felt less like a choice and more like a capitulation to an undeniable truth. A truth I had fought tooth and nail to bury. I would go. I would walk into that house, into the epicenter of my pain and their judgment. I would endure Michelle's venom, my parents' icy disappointment. I would do it for her, because any victory, any empire I might build with Sterling Pike would be a barren, meaningless wasteland if I let her call go unanswered. What triumph was there in conquering a world if, in doing so, you became a monster to the only person who had ever loved you unconditionally? It was more than a turning point. It felt like a schism in my very being. The dam of my rage didn't just crack, it imploded. The anger, the defiance hadn't evaporated, but they were now submerged, drowned in a flood of sorrow so profound it was a physical weight, a crushing sense of loss for what was irretrievably broken. The live stream had been my declaration of independence, this silent, agonizing assent to return. To face the source of my deepest wounds was an act of something far more terrifying: surrender. A desperate primal need for a connection I myself had sought to destroy. I couldn't name it. I only knew I was going. And that single, reluctant step backward felt more momentous, more terrifyingly real, and disturbingly more human than signing that defiant check under the blaze of 1,000 hostile eyes. The war was not over. But its landscape, and the soldier fighting it, had irrevocably changed. The drive to my parents' house, the house I grew up in, felt like a journey into a hostile past. Every landmark, every familiar street corner, was layered with memories, most of them now tainted by the bitter lens of betrayal. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. The family-only stipulation for grandmother's 80th meant no Evelyn Hayes for backup, no Sterling Pike lawyer on speed dial. Just me, walking into the heart of Tran territory, armed with nothing but a reluctantly rediscovered conscience and a deep-seated dread. The house, a sprawling, tastefully opulent testament to my parents' success, looked strangely menacing in the late afternoon sun. As I parked, I saw Michelle's car already there, a sleek black German import. Naturally, figures. She'd be inside, holding court, the dutiful daughter, the triumphant CEO. Taking a deep breath, a shallow, inadequate defense against the impending storm, I walked to the front door. It opened before I could knock. My mother stood there, her face a carefully composed mask of strained neutrality. Her eyes, though, those betrayed a flicker of something: relief, apprehension. It was impossible to tell. "Alex," she said, her voice devoid of its usual warmth. "Your grandmother is in the sunroom. She's been asking for you." No hug, no welcome, just a directive. The house felt cold, despite the lavish furnishings. The air was thick with unspoken accusations. I could hear muffled voices from the direction of the sunroom. My father's booming baritone, Michelle's clear, confident tones. My stomach churned. This was a mistake. A terrible, self-inflicted mistake. As I stepped into the sunroom, the conversation stopped. Dead. 3 pairs of eyes swiveled towards me. My father, his face like granite, a deep frown etched between his brows. Michelle, perched elegantly on an armchair, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing on her lips, the smile of a predator that knows its prey has walked into the trap. And my grandmother, she was in her favorite wicker chair by the window, a light shawl around her shoulders. She looked smaller than I remembered, frailer, but her eyes, when they found mine, lit up with a genuine, unreserved warmth that was a stark contrast to the icy reception from the others. "Alex," she whispered, her voice a little thin, but clear. "You came." She reached out a trembling hand. I crossed the room, ignoring the palpable hostility radiating from my father and sister, and took her hand. It felt delicate, papery. "Of course. Grandmother," I said, my voice hoarse. "Happy birthday. It is happier now you are here, child," she said, squeezing my hand weakly. The pleasantry, however, was short-lived. My father cleared his throat, a sound like rocks grinding together. "Alex, so you decided to grace us with your presence." His tone was heavy with sarcasm. "Dad," I began, aiming for civility. "Don't dad me," he snapped, his voice rising. "Do you have any idea at all, the damage you've done, the humiliation you've brought upon this family, upon Tran Consolidated?" "I did what I thought was necessary," I said. My own anger, suppressed for days, starting to flare. After I was systematically excluded and undervalued, Michelle scoffed, finally speaking. Her voice was silk stretched over steel. "You were never excluded, Alex. You simply lacked the vision, the drive. We gave you opportunities. You were adequate. But adequacy doesn't build empires. Adequacy," the word was a slap. "I built the financial models that underpinned half your visionary projects. Michelle, I identified cost savings you never bothered to look for. I was the one ensuring the numbers actually worked while you were busy with photo ops. Enough." My father roared, slamming his hand on a nearby table, making the teacups rattle. "This is not the time or place. This is your grandmother's birthday." "Oh, let them, dear," my grandmother said, her voice surprisingly firm. "Perhaps it's time some things were aired, secrets and resentments. They fester like an untended wound." Michelle leaned forward, her eyes glittering. "He thinks he's some kind of martyr, some unsung genius. The truth, Alex, is that Sterling Pike saw an opportunity to exploit a disgruntled employee, a weak link. They're using you, and you, in your childish tantrum, walked right into their arms." "They recognized my value," I retorted, my voice rising to match hers. "Something my own family was incapable of doing. They offered me a partnership, respect, not pitying offers to manage your personal portfolio." The air crackled with tension. My mother stood by the doorway, wringing her hands, her face pale. My father looked like he was about to explode. "And your grand gesture," Michelle continued, her voice dripping with disdain. "Cashing their check on a live stream, a cheap, desperate stunt. It made you look pathetic, not powerful." "It got your attention, didn't it?" I shot back. "It got the world's attention. It showed that Tran Consolidated isn't infallible, that its own blood was willing to bet against it. How's the stock price looking these days? Michelle, that employee loyalty initiative. How many key people are quietly updating their resumes because they see the writing on the wall? Because they see you'd rather promote a sycophant than retain actual talent." That hit a nerve. A flicker of something. Anger. Maybe even fear crossed Michelle's face before her mask of cool composure snapped back into place. My father stepped forward. "You will not speak to your sister that way in this house." "Why not?" I challenged, turning to him. "Is the truth too uncomfortable? You two groomed her for the throne, ignored my contributions, dismissed my ambitions. You made your choice. I made mine." "Your choice was to betray us," he thundered. My choice was to survive, I yelled back, the years of frustration, of being silenced, finally erupting. You were suffocating me. You left me no other option but to find my own air to breathe, my own ground to stand on. Suddenly, my grandmother struggled to sit up straighter, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Please, children, no more fighting. Her face was ashen. My mother rushed to her side. Lynn, are you all right? A wave of guilt washed over me, dousing my anger. This was exactly what I hadn't wanted. I had come for her, and I had brought the war to her doorstep. Michelle, however, seemed to see an opportunity. Look what you've done, Alex, she said, her voice laced with false concern. You're upsetting grandmother. All your dramatics. But before she could finish, my grandmother spoke, her voice weak but surprisingly steady, her eyes fixed on me, then sweeping to my father and Michelle. Stop it, all of you. The command, though quiet, silenced the room. She took a shaky breath. Your grandfather and I, we built this company with our bare hands, not for empires, not for fighting, for family, for a better future. Her gaze settled on my father. You wanted a legacy. Min, you got it. But you forgot what holds a legacy together. Then she looked at Michelle. And you, Michelle, you are smart, so smart. But sometimes, intelligence lacks wisdom. True strength isn't about crushing others. It's about lifting them. Finally, her eyes, clouded with pain but still sharp, found mine. Alex, my brave, foolish boy, you have a fire in you, a good fire, but you let your hurt make you reckless. She coughed, a dry, painful sound. This path you're on, it will cost you. It will cost all of us. Her words, more than all the shouting, landed with a devastating impact. The raw emotion, the clear-sighted, unbiased assessment from the one person whose opinion I valued above all others, cut through the animosity. The fight drained out of me, replaced by a profound, aching sadness. My father looked away, his face unreadable. Michelle's smirk had vanished, replaced by a rare expression of uncertainty. My grandmother closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again. A deep weariness etched on her face. There is enough blame to go around for everyone here today, she said softly. The question is, what now? Is this how the Tran family story ends, in bitterness and public shame? The sunroom was silent, save for her ragged breathing, the confrontation I had dreaded. The explosion I had anticipated had happened. But it wasn't the clean, victorious takedown I might have fantasized about during my angriest moments. It was messy, painful, and her words, her quiet, devastating truth, had exposed the raw, bleeding wounds of everyone involved. The power hadn't so much reversed as it had shattered, leaving us all standing in the wreckage. The consequences were no longer abstract. They were etched on the faces of my family, and most painfully, on the frail, beloved face of my grandmother. The check I cashed felt 1,000,000 miles away, a symbolic gesture whose real-world fallout was far more complex and agonizing than I could have ever imagined. The fragile truce brokered by my grandmother's words held for the remainder of her birthday. It was a strained, artificial peace, thick with unspoken resentments and the ghosts of our recent battle. We ate cake, made stilted conversation, and avoided eye contact. Michelle was subdued, her usual confident pronouncements replaced by a watchful silence. My father retreated into a grim, brooding quiet, his earlier fury banked but clearly not extinguished. My mother fluttered nervously, trying to smooth over the chasms that had been ripped open. I focused on my grandmother, fetching her tea, listening to her stories of the old country, a desperate attempt to cling to the one untainted connection left in that fractured room. When it was time to leave, my grandmother held my hand tightly. "Be careful, Alex," she whispered, her eyes searching mine. "Anger is a powerful current. Don't let it carry you so far you can't find your way back." Her words were a plea and a warning. The drive back to my apartment was heavy with a different kind of silence than the one on the way there. The rage had dissipated, leaving behind a desolate landscape of regret and confusion. Grandmother's words had reframed everything: my victory on the live stream, my successes at Sterling Pike, suddenly felt hollow. Had I proven my worth, or had I just proven I could inflict pain as effectively as it had been inflicted upon me in the days and weeks that followed? There was no dramatic reconciliation, no tearful apologies. The battle lines remained. But the nature of the war had shifted. Michelle's public attacks ceased. Tran consolidated. Under what I could only assume was pressure from my father, influenced by my grandmother's plea, adopted a more measured, less openly hostile stance. The legal threats evaporated. It wasn't forgiveness, not by a long shot. It was more like a ceasefire, born out of exhaustion and a shared dawning horror at the abyss we had collectively stared into. My work at Sterling Pike continued, and I excelled. Evelyn Hayes, perceptive as ever, noted the change in me. "You've got your fight back," she'd said one afternoon, after a particularly grueling but successful negotiation. "But you've lost some of the brittleness. Good. Rage is a motivator, but it's a lousy long-term strategy." She was right. The raw, consuming anger had been replaced by a colder, more focused determination. I wasn't just fighting against my family anymore. I was fighting for something, for a future I could define on my own terms, built on merit, not birthright or bitterness. The most significant change was internal. My grandmother's words had been a mirror, forcing me to confront the less palatable aspects of my own actions. The lat keo, the dramatic reversal, had been undeniably effective, but at what cost I had wanted to be seen, to be valued, and in my desperation, I had wielded my pain like a weapon, ensuring I was seen, but perhaps in a way that overshadowed any genuine value I possessed. Months later, my grandmother passed away peacefully in her sleep. The news, when my mother called, her voice thick with tears, hit me with the force of a physical blow. The entire family gathered for the funeral, a somber, fractured assembly. At the reception, Michelle approached me. It was the first time we'd spoken directly, without animosity, since that terrible birthday. "Grandmother left something for you," she said, her voice low, devoid of its usual edge. She handed me a small, lacquered box. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded silk, was an old, intricately carved wooden bird, a toy our grandfather had made, one that had always sat on grandmother's dresser, a symbol of simpler times, of beginnings. "She always said you saw things differently. Alex," Michelle continued, her gaze distant, "that you saw the patterns no one else did. Maybe she was right. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't absolution, but it was something, a crack in the wall of her certainty. I didn't return to Tran Consolidated. The bridges, though no longer actively burning, were too scarred, the trust too irrevocably broken. I continued to build my career at Sterling Pike, carving out a niche for myself based on the skills and insights my family had once dismissed. The rivalry between Sterling Pike and Tran Consolidated continued. But it felt different now, less personal, more a standard feature of the competitive landscape. Sometimes, late at night, when the city was quiet, I would take out the wooden bird. It was a reminder, not of the victory or the betrayal, but of my grandmother's wisdom, of the complex, messy reality of family, and the enduring truth that sometimes the fiercest battles are fought not for empires or revenge, but for a quiet understanding of one's own worth, and for the painful, necessary growth that can only come from confronting the deepest wounds. There was no neat resolution, no storybook ending where everyone hugged and made up. The scars remained. But there was a sense of peace, a hard-won clarity. I had cashed that check on Livestream, a desperate act of defiance. In doing so, I had torched my old life, but from those ashes, something new, something more authentic, had slowly, painstakingly, begun to grow. The confrontation hadn't brought justice in the way I'd initially imagined, but it had brought a measure of self-awareness, and perhaps a more profound understanding of what it truly meant to build a legacy, not just of wealth or power, but of resilience, and the courage to find your own way, even if that path led you far from home. The relationship with my sister remained fraught, a landscape of unspoken regrets and unresolved history. But the war, at least the one raging within me, was finally over.